The hearing is now resumed.
Commissioner Tim Timberg for Government of Canada. I'll be spending approximately an hour talking about the development of policy, focusing on the wild salmon policy, and speaking briefly to our reply submissions. My intention is to follow Canada's written submissions quite closely, and I've provided a list for Mr. Lund, our registrar, to assist me in my oral submissions. So I will be going from paragraph to paragraph in our written submissions. I'd like to start in Canada's written submissions at page 103, paragraph 353. And this is to provide the factual context to the state of the fisheries on the West Coast. The wild salmon policy was created in a context that began almost 30 years ago, with issues of biodiversity and conservation biology coming to the forefront in the early 1980s. The first significant event is the Pacific Salmon Treaty was signed in 1985. It required the identification of specific stocks in mixed stock salmon fisheries, which in turn led to the application of newly developed genetic research methods to salmon and increased understanding of their genetic diversity. And during this time, key science papers on conservation and environmental events were published, and there was a growing environmentalism. The second, paragraph 354, this emerging concern for biodiversity accumulated in the international stage with the signing of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992, the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit. David Bevan and Mark Saunders spoke about the convention being a major driver for the development of the wild salmon policy. Over to paragraph 355. Then in the late 80s and early 90s, we saw the beginning of this decrease in sockeye and other Pacific salmon species, productivity and corresponding management actions by DFO to restrict outer marine fisheries, reduce exploitation rates, and move progressively towards a more conservative approach in fisheries management. Brian Riddle, Dr. Riddle, spoke about this move to protect weak stock, was perhaps best exemplified by DFO's response to the 1998 coho crisis by reducing the exploitation rate to zero. It's in this context of declining productivity and exploitation rates that a more precautionary, more conservative approach to fisheries management was reflected in the 1998 New Direction Policy document. So I'd like to focus on that document this morning. We can flip to page 51 of our submissions. This is a section that I'll now run forward, talking about policy development at DFO. And this section, what is a policy? Paragraph 194, DFO manages fisheries in accordance with a series of policies developed to provide guidance on numerous and complex issues. They provide a framework for decision making, but they do not fetter the Minister's discretion under Section 9 of the Fisheries Act. Over at paragraph 196, we set out that policies come in a variety of forms, depending on the audience and the intent of the policy. And Sue Farlinger and Brian and David Bevan spoke about there are several different terms used by DFO in the development and presentation of policies. For example, a discussion paper is often written to help facilitate consultation. Once consultation has been completed and the policy is approved, it's often called a vision, reform, new direction, or framework. With that, a brief overview of policy. If we could turn over the page to paragraph 202, at page 53. What we say is that the development of DFO policy, there emerges four key policy themes. And that is 1, conservation, 2, sustainable use, 3, consultation and decision making, and 4, collaboration and co-management. It's not in our written submissions, but exhibit 1924 is an exhibit that Sue Farlinger entered where she divided DFO's policies into those four themes, and we suggest that's a helpful place for you to organize DFO's policies around those themes. And I know it's not in our written submissions, but Exhibit 1923 and 1923A was the large chart that we prepared of all of the treaties, acts, regulations, and policies, programs, and procedures. And you have a hyperlinked disk to assist you with that. So these 4 policy themes then are captured in the 1998 paper, A New Direction for Canada's Pacific Salmon Fisheries, and which described conservation as a primary objective for managing the wild salmon resource. And as I've stated, the impetus for that was conservation. I think it's helpful for us to look at these 12 broad principles that are set out in New Direction. So I'm wondering, Mr. Lund, we could go to Exhibit 32. And if we could go to page 5. And Mr. Commissioner, I thought this policy is still in effect. This is the conservation, the New Direction policy. And I thought it would be helpful just if we could briefly look at these 12 policies. So, first one, conservation of Pacific salmon stocks is the primary objective. So there it is, front line and center. It's the number 1. We go down to Principle 2. A precautionary approach to fisheries management will continue to be adopted. So again, tying it back to the International Convention. 3. Principle 3. Continue to work towards a net gain in productive capacity for salmon habitat. So the importance of habitat. 4. An ecological approach will guide fisheries and oceans management in the future. And we can see that with Deputy Dansereau's testimony about the importance of ecosystems management that's being implemented now. Over the page, Principle 5, at the very bottom. The long-term productivity of the resource will not be compromised because of short-term factors or considerations. Trade-offs between current harvest benefits and long-term stock well-being will be resolved in favor of the long term. You can see that principle continuing to exist through the wild salmon policy and other management decisions today. Over the page, Principle 6. All sectors, First Nations, recreational, and commercial, will use selective methods to harvest salmon. Selective fishing policy comes from this. Over the page, Principle 7. First Nations requirements for food, social, and ceremonial purposes will continue to have first priority after conservation requirements. Principle 8. Wherever possible, the recreational fishery will be provided with more reliable and stable fishing opportunities. And then over the page, Principle 9. The commercial fishery will be a more diversified, less dependent on salmon, an economically viable sector, better able to withstand fluctuations in the cycle of the resource in the market. And we've heard about the decline of the share that the commercial salmon has in the commercial fishery. Over to the next page, Principle 10. Clear, objective, and relevant information on major issues requiring decisions will be provided to the public with sufficient time and opportunity for review, comment, and feedback. Periodic review of progress and achievements will be initiated to facilitate accountability for the sound management of the salmon resource and its habitat. You can see in the wild salmon policy these principles are resonating throughout what DFO does. Principle 11, government and stakeholders will together be responsible and accountable for sustainable fisheries. So that all partners work together to ensure a sustainable fisheries. And over the page, Principle 12, enhanced community, regional, and sector-wide input to decision-making will be pursued through a structured management and advisory board system, which ends up kind of being the IFMP process that gets developed. So this is back in 1998. It's a core document, policy, and I just thought it'd be helpful to suggest that those principles are certainly alive and well in that policy today, but can assist the Commissioner in making your report and recommendations. I could then go back to our written submissions at page 54. So out of the New Direction paper, this committed DFO to developing a detailed set of operational policies for the management of the salmon resource. And what came from that was an allocation policy for Pacific salmon 1999, approved decision-making 2000, policy for selective fishing 2001, and wild salmon policy 2005. So that's the start of the big important conservation policy. We then in our written submissions talk about the four key themes, and we break them down: conservation, sustainable use, consultation, and decision making. I'll just flip through this because it speaks for itself, Mr. Commissioner. But under conservation, we talk about the sustainable fisheries framework. And then over the page of 55, wild salmon policy. Paragraph 210, we note the Pacific Salmon Revitalized Strategy initiated in 1996. That was a program with money involved, and that was a fleet reduction program through license retirement. So it's just an important factual program. And paragraph 212, we note the importance for conservation is the policy for the management of fish habitat. And so those are the ones that fit together under that theme. Sustainable use, paragraph 215, we have the policy for selective fishing in Canada's Pacific fisheries. I note that a number of the participants in their submission said that this either wasn't continuing. The program ended in 2002, but the policy continues. And so this is the policy, and we've summarized the 5 principles. And the main part really being with respect to selective fishing policy. We've set out the 5 principles, which I'll leave for you to read, but at paragraph 217, we say it's the avoidance of non-target species is the best possible option in selective fishing, to not catch the bycatch, to only catch what you're after. And then the second next best option is to release non-target fish, invertebrates, seabirds, alive and unharmed. And so that is an ongoing policy today. And that affects decisions with respect to a move to more in-river fisheries. There's some of the directions with the share-based management, choosing beach seiners over gill netters. You can see that that's a very important policy. Moving down to page 58, the bottom, paragraph 222, we set out consultation and decision making and the key policies there. Much of those at paragraph 224 relate to Aboriginal consultation. I'll focus a bit on paragraph 226. DFO initiated an independent review of their decision-making with the University of Victoria, and that resulted in a framework for improved decision-making. That's right, 226. And at 227, the goal was to establish a framework that's more open and predictable with decision-making. And this established the IHPC Committee, Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, flowed out of that. Paragraph 229, we summarize the guidance provided to DFO with respect to a framework for the application of precaution in science-based decision-making about risk. So paragraph 229, that's the Treasury Board policy that that applies to all of government. And that provides guidance on application of precaution to decision-making about risks of serious or irreversible harm where there is lack of full scientific certainty. Paragraph 230 is the DFO policy, and that's a fishery decision-making framework incorporating the precautionary approach. So this policy is how to incorporate the precautionary principle in harvest strategies. So if the Treasury Board is about decision-making, the DFO one is about how to incorporate that into harvest strategies, so it's more operational. Now, sticking on paragraph 230, Mr. Commissioner, David Bevan when he spoke about the precautionary approach, said, this is DFO's policy on the precautionary approach, but it doesn't apply to salmon because of the life cycle of salmon. It's such a short life, they go out and they come back and they only spawn once. So he said, DFO's response to the precautionary approach is the wild salmon policy. They needed to write a very separate and specific policy to address precautionary approach just for salmon, and they did that. So you can see we had the International, we have the Treasury Board, we have DFO, all talking about precautionary approach. And for salmon, it's the wild salmon policy. And I've jumped, but that's in our submissions at page 106, paragraphs 364 to 367. I won't take you there. We could go over the page to page 61. We've got this fourth theme of collaboration and co-management, and we've listed the policies associated there at paragraph 232, so I'll leave that. But I would like to talk about paragraph 238, Pacific Fisheries Reform. So Pacific Fisheries Reform was introduced in 2005. And I will like to jump here to page 171 of our submissions, to paragraph 581. This is a paragraph that describes the genesis for Pacific fishery reform. The concept of share-based management of Pacific salmon came into focus with the report of the Joint Task Group on Post-Treaty Fisheries. It's a document called Treaties in Transition, commonly, in which an individual transferable quota was recommended as a way of improving the management and sustainability of the commercial salmon fishery. So that was pretty strong medicine, perhaps some people might say. The report of the First Nations Panel on Fisheries, commonly called Our Place at the Table, opposed the further expansion of individual transferable quotas until First Nations interests had been addressed. That was the other significant document. DFO's response to these two reports was the announcement of fishery management reform initiative called Pacific Fishery Reform. And this acknowledges that more certainty and stability in the commercial fishery could be achieved through some type of share-based management. But that's not a full explanation of Pacific Fisheries Reform, because this is in a share-based management section. But I just wanted to highlight that Pacific Fishery Reform is a response to the treaty process. So with that, if we can go back to page 62. And back to paragraph 238. So Pacific Fisheries Reform contains policies, principles associated with improving the economic viability and sustainable management of commercial fisheries for addressing First Nations interests in FSC's fisheries, commercial access, and involvement in management, for ensuring all fishery participants enjoy certainty and stability, and for ensuring that participants are self-reliant, self-adjusted, treated fairly and equitably, and involved in decision-making. And then work has also been initiated with the recreational sector. Go over the page then to paragraph 239. Pacific Fisheries Reform is intended to guide reform initiatives and is the standard against which alternative approaches will be evaluated. This is, Pacific Fisheries Reform is at Exhibit 269, and I thought we should perhaps look at this also. So this, the top of the page sets out the key elements of Pacific Fisheries Reform. And then the key elements are improved resource conservation, so that's obvious. And then over the page, 6, improved certainty and stability. This is all in relationship to making room for treaty. 6, First Nations place in the fishery. 7, shared management responsibility and accountability. And then realizing the social and economic potential. So I just share these main points and draw your attention to them. At page 22 of this document, this is not in our written submissions, but page 22 has a section titled Reform in the Pacific Salmon Fishery. So this is, again, salmon being different than the other fish in the sea. It required its own special section to address under Pacific Fisheries Reform. And so I just, so here, obviously, we have to address conservation. Defining catch shares is deemed to be important. That's so that we can understand catch shares as between the various stakeholders. Transferability, in the middle of page 23, is important to be able to transfer shares between the marine fisheries and possibly in-river fisheries, and to ensure that there can be some fairness and clarity with respect to any transfers that happen, so that the various participants and stakeholders know what's happening. Over the page, recreational fisheries have their place, and then co-management, this move towards co-management. So, so I thought those were the two key policies that you should be alive to, and the themes and the issues as you consider the task before yourself. If I could then go back to Canada's submissions at paragraph 240 on page 63. Pacific Integrated Commercial Fisheries Initiative, PICFI. So PICFI is not a policy, it's a program, and it had money attached to it, and it will be sunsetting this coming July 2012. And it emerged out of Pacific Fisheries Reform. And it operationalized the themes and the policy directions set out there. And so the PICFI builds on the work under Pacific Fisheries Reform. I'm at paragraph 241, and it's aimed at establishing fully integrated commercial fisheries where all commercial harvesters fish under common and transparent rules, the higher standard of accountability for all resource users, and strengthen collaboration and cooperation. PICFI also supports British Columbia Aboriginal groups in integrated commercial fisheries to develop sustainable fisheries enterprises and to increase Aboriginal groups' participation in fisheries management decision-making processes. So I would now like to move to page 171 of our submissions. And this is sort of where are we today? If that was perhaps some of the building blocks of the policy to date, this section, I'll suggest, sort of states where we are now. And go to 582. So this section, my colleague Mr. Taylor provided an overview. This section of our written submissions, Mr. Commissioner, deals with international allocation, domestic allocation, FSC, recreational, the IFNP process. I thought I'd just focus a bit on the share-based management. So at 582, DFO has an interest in moving to share-based management where it can be demonstrated it's feasible and effective in advancing the vision articulated in Pacific Fisheries Reform, that of a sustainable fishery in which full social and economic potential are achieved. We've set out the benefits there. At paragraph 583, we just note the evidence that DFO has been working with willing commercial fleets and Aboriginal groups since 2005 to test alternative forms of share-based management through demonstration fisheries. And so the section there, why demonstration fisheries? The reason why DFO uses demonstration fisheries, first, demonstration fisheries have been undertaken to test and evaluate share-based management before a recommendation to the minister as to a more permanent implementation in the salmon fishery. So the ability of share-based management to deliver must be evaluated, and so that's why we have the demonstration fisheries. Go over to paragraph 586. Second, while a share-based management approach has been enthusiastically embraced by some harvest interesters, some in the commercial sector are strongly opposed to it. And we talked about the evidence, the SCORE report, and the various sort of studies that have been done. And then going down to how do demonstration fisheries work at paragraph 588, DFO puts out annual calls for proposals for demonstration fisheries that are consistent with the visions and principles of Pacific fishery reform. So again, the linkage back to the policy. 590, two different types of share-based management fisheries have been tested. A decision has not been made. We could go over to page 175. We've got the evaluation of share-based management and future steps. We just note at paragraph 594, the pace of demonstration fisheries has been slow due to recent closures of the fisheries when there were the low returns, and that's hampered the ability of these demonstration fisheries. And then over at page 176, we just note the testimony of Sue Farlinger that a time frame for the provision of DFO advice to the Minister on share-based management has not yet been determined. With that policy overview, I'll just sort of walk you through then a few smaller sections in our written submissions and provide some highlights. We go to page 77, Mr. Long. So this section of our written submissions provides background material on the summary of key evidence regarding the causes of the decline of Fraser River stocks. It's my own personal opinion this is not that contentious, given the evidence that's been led. Paragraph 287, I'll just move through this fairly quickly, just note some of the high points. A consensus appears to be emerging among scientists that biophysical changes in the marine environment stand out as the most strongly inferred factors explaining the pre-2010 decline. And we heard this consensus coming through a variety of workshops, and David Marmark spoke about that. I could then go to page 80, paragraph 300. The panel has also agreed that multiple hypothesized causal mechanisms are very likely to be operating simultaneously, and their effects may be additive, multiplicative, i.e. synergistic, or may tend to offset one another's effects, i.e. there was no one smoking gun found, that there were a number of factors. Mr. Marmarak spoke to that, as did the conclusions to the various workshops. We could then move to page 94. This now is a section, actually 93, perhaps we should look at page 93, Mr. Lang, the entire page. It's a new section, a summary of key evidence regarding the current state of Fraser River sockeye and long-term projections. There's the chart of Fraser River sockeye productivity that we've had evidence about with the increased returns in 2010 and 11. And I just note at the bottom there, paragraph 330, we just caution that it's important to note that this graph represents all Fraser sockeye and that there's an increased amount of variation in productivity between Fraser sockeye stocks. So that's an average of all the stocks. So there's even more variation when you look at the different CUs within that. And then over to paragraph 332, we just note the important evidence that the decline in productivity for Fraser sockeye stocks corresponded with similar declines in productivity for other sockeye salmon stocks. And that led to, throughout the hearings, comments from the scientists that not only do we need data and information about the Fraser River, but we also need that data information from other rivers and other systems to be able to place the Fraser in context. So that was an important reminder. And if we could go to page 97, please, Mr. Lund. At paragraph 338, we've reproduced here the evidence of David Bevan, Associate Deputy Minister, where he spoke about the precautionary approach. And he commented that the maximum sustainable yield, which is an assumption that you can have a sustainable yield of high level based on a higher level of population, that, well, we've rejected that as a reality. that this idea that lakes have a maximum sustainable yield that you can aim for, that due to the precautionary approach has been rejected. And then if we could move to page 102 at paragraph 351, we've just summarized the important evidence of Dr. John Davis, who spoke about his work internationally dealing with climate change, and that climate change is of course not just affecting Fraser sockeye, it's creating more uncertainty with respect to fisheries around the world. And that managers around the world must increasingly account for these uncertainties in managing fisheries resources and ecosystems. Now, over the page, Mr. Lund, we have a new section to our submissions. D, a summary of key evidence regarding improving the future sustainability of the sockeye salmon fishery in the Fraser River. Now, at paragraph 353 and on, we summarize. Sorry, I started there, but this is about the wild salmon policy, Mr. Commissioner. Here you'll see, Mr. Commissioner, that we note the connections between the wild salmon policy and the new direction policy that I brought you to earlier. And so here we've taken the 12 principles from the new direction policy and we've linked them to the strategies and the steps in the wild salmon policy. So you can see that the direction that was provided back in 1998 under new direction has found its way into the wild salmon policy in 2005. Conservation first priority, continued adoption of precautionary approach, etc. And so we've done that linkage for you. We could then go to page 105, paragraph 359. And it's stating the obvious now, but Principle 1 of the Wild Salmon Policy states that, quote, conservation of wild Pacific salmon and their habitats is the highest priority in resource management decision making. And while stock-specific management had been utilized by DFO since the 1980s, pursuant to the direction of the Pacific Salmon Treaty, the wild salmon policy was a step forward in that it indicated with specificity what needed to be conserved, the genetic diversity as defined by the Conservation Unit. I could then go to paragraph 368. Yes, and actually 367 above is the connection between the precautionary principle and the wild salmon policy, and it expressly adopts the precautionary approach. And then 368, in reviewing this, the wild salmon policy has two benchmarks to ensure the conservation of salmon. Not one benchmark, it's two benchmarks. There's one between the red and the amber, and one between amber and red. And the two of them work together to ensure the conservation of the salmon, and they require different steps to be taken. And so, just as a refresher, paragraph 369, the lower benchmark is intended to provide a buffer not only above a minimum viable population level, but it's intended to allow for continued limited FSC fishing by First Nations on particular local conservation units, conservation permitting. So again, it ties in conservation and FSC fishing. So you can see this interweaving of conservation and treaty obligations coming together in DFO's policies as to how they're managing the fisheries. And it's those two core aspects that are needed to be pulled together. Over the page, 108, paragraph 371. So here, under Strategy 4, just note that the societal views that may dictate one approach one day may change very quickly, meaning that prescriptive or top-down management decisions will quickly be out of date. Pat Schmidt spoke about that, Dr. Irvine spoke about that. Even the notion of a single optimal escapement target is a view from the past. Optimal escapement is not something that is stable over time. And these are part of the reasons for this consultative approach to strategy 4 decision making, to ensure that it's responsive, it's an ongoing part of the management decisions. And then page 112, paragraph 383, is the pace of implementation of action steps. And I just note in the middle of paragraph 383, the WSP states at page 35 and 36 of the actual policy that implementation will be phased in gradually, and it does not specify a time frame for full implementation. It's this context that has set the pace. And Sue Farlinger, in her testimony, the RDG said that the timelines for the implementation of all action steps contemplated within DFO in the early stages of the implementation planning were, with hindsight, unrealistic. Mr. Commissioner, we've summarized the steps taken on each action step in the wild salmon policy in our written submissions. I'm just taking you to highlights. If we could go to page 118, paragraph 408. A number of the participants in their submissions said that no habitat status reports have been completed under the wild salmon policy, and the evidence is that 5 habitat overview reports and 9 partial habitat status reports were piloted prior to 2008. That was the testimony of Heather Stahlberg. And then 6 habitat status reports have since been completed for the Somas, Bedwell, San Juan, Lower Harrison, Sarita, and Cowichan Kosiha systems. If we could then move to page 122, paragraph 423. Mark Saunders spoke about the scientific foundation of strategies 1 to 3 has nearly been laid, and progress on these strategies will continue. Implementation is now at a tipping point where status assessment can begin and strategy 4 implementation can begin. However, strategy 4 is the most challenging strategy to implement. That's just a reminder that much of the work to date has been on the background science of steps 1, 2, and 3, and much of that now is completing. Over the page, paragraph, the top of page 123, we filed in evidence Exhibit 945A is a large spreadsheet of 516 meeting days since 2005 that DFO has held that are relevant to aspects of implementation of the wild salmon policy, including Strategy 4. That exhibit, you can click, it's an active CD, you can click on it and it'll take you to each of the agendas of those meetings and the minutes of meetings for 516 meeting days. So a huge amount of consultation has been done on wild salmon policy implementation, including Strategy 4. The next section, work on identification of priority CUs. This is an issue that has been raised by a number of participants in their submissions. Paragraph 426. To date, a methodology for the identification of priority CUs presented to senior management has not been approved. However, in the absence of the identification of priority CUs as described in the WSP, DFO has in the interim prioritized the stock of concerns as identified in the annual salmon outlook. So we had evidence from Mark Saunders and others about how the salmon outlook is being utilized. Paragraph 427, interim prioritization on the basis of stock of concerns does not negate DFO's intention to identify priority CUs. DFO plans to reinitiate this process once the grant et al. Working paper is complete. And there'll be more information on her paper shortly, I'd expect. And then finally, in addition, in 2009, the Strategic Directions Committee, I'm at paragraph 427, gave support to the development of a rapid assessment methodology. A draft of that methodology and assessment since has been completed by Dr. Holpe and is currently undergoing revisions. So I note the time, Mr. Commissioner.
The hearing will now adjourn until 2 p.m.